before we start, let me pass the socks around once again. We encourage and welcome donations. If you'd like to make a $15 donation, you can do that downstairs and you become a member. And that means you get newsletters and information from us about other programs going on. We have a couple distinguished guests here, and one has asked for a word. And Warren A. is a military historian.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. Just want to be real brief. There's a new armory being constructed in the Dalles by the Oregon National Guard, and I've been tasked with coming up recommending names for this new armory. And so if any of you are interested in participating in that process, let me know and I'll give you my card so you can contact me, and I'll contact the various historical societies too. Basically, the criteria are that it should be somebody who has an Oregon military background, made a contribution to the community, region, or state, is deceased, has not been significantly honored otherwise, but maybe has been decorated or otherwise recognized. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a person, it could be an object or a geographical feature we can use. So, like I say, if you want to participate in this process, just let me know and I'll give you a card. The Adjutant General of the State of Oregon is the one who will make the final decision. We just make recommendations to them.
Okay, and another distinguished guest here is Lord Irving. Lord is with the Oregon Historic Trails Advisory Council. They mark the trails and preserve the trails and preserve that history. And we're going to get him back here one of these years to do a program on Fremont. Some of you saw it out at Discovery Center, but he does a wonderful program tracing Fremont's travels through this country. Well, a lot of things happened right here at the Dalles in years gone by, and in the earliest days of white settlement, this of course was a military fort. You do have to imagine a time when there weren't all the roads and all the connections that you see now. When the Oregon Trail was really a number of sets of ruts across the hills and valleys leading to this place. And then imagine what it would be like to move a whole army through that kind of land. And of course the military presence here was very important in mapping the land and getting preserving the safety of the settlers, all kinds of things that were accomplished in those early years. Well, we have to thank Sandy Bissett for running into Malin Kriegel out at Discovery Center when he was doing some research there several months ago. And he has done this little booklet on the Steptoe campaign, which was the prelude to the Colonel Wright campaign. And Steptoe's campaign turned into somewhat of a disaster. And Malin's studies of those original field drawings and maps really tell a different story than the one that has been passed down, and that's a very interesting read. But he has studied these maps, which were done by the topographer who went along on the Colonel Wright campaign, and he's going to tell us all about that. And should we figure out now or wait till afterwards? He is willing to do some field trips out here in Wasco County and Sherman County, tracing the route. He'll be willing to do that tomorrow, but we haven't picked a time.
This we can talk about afterwards.
Do it afterwards?
Because
Okay.
I'm hoping there'll be some questions.
Oh, there will be definitely questions. Okay, those who are interested in that trip, some of you did sign up and were demonstrated your interest in it, but we didn't give you a time. You'll have to come up and figure that out among yourselves at the end of the program. Malin, it's all yours, and I think things are working now. You're on.
Is this mic working?
Yes.
It's quite by chance that I became an amateur historian. The family farm that I retired to is not far from the Lapway Trail, which was the Nez Perce Trail from Lewiston to Spokane or Coeur d'Alene. And so I got interested in Indian trails. And doing that, I went to Catawba and visited with Father Connolly, who didn't know anything about trails, but his interest was in Selah and early Coeur d'Alene history. Selah was a camas ground of the Coeur d'Alene Indians. They'd been hunting for it for years. They didn't know where it was. He wanted to find it, and I said, okay, I'll keep my mind open and ears open. And I indeed stumbled across it in the Mullen papers, and those were published in the 35th Congressional Record, as many of you know. So I wanted to look at the original Mullen record. A trip to Washington, D.C., to the archives. I knew the call number. Several people had given me that information, but I was unprepared when they brought out 6 cartons of material. And the Mullen field notes were just a couple field note booklets in this huge array of material they brought out. And so I thought I would thumb through and see what I would find. And one of them happened to be the field notes made by Kriegel, and I show this one here. And these little booklets are 3.5 inches by 7 inches. And Kriegel was a master draftsman. Kriegel was with Wright on the Wright campaign, who followed 4 months after the Steptoe campaign. So we're really going to go through 2 battles. The Steptoe battle, which is called Battle of Tohobanimi, that occurred a little bit north of modern-day Rosalia, and then spend time on the Wright campaign, which was a lot larger and had far more impact. Although the Steptoe campaign, which led into the Wright campaign, had enormous impact on the outcome, as it turns out, of the Wright campaign. Well, anyway, it was quite by chance that I stumbled across this Kriegel field note map. I have a field note booklet, which has about 150 maps in it. And the way they would do it at the time, on the right hand, when you open up the book, on the right hand page was a map. And the left hand was the bearings and locations of all of the points that he used to make and construct the map. And to give an idea, because this area here is of local interest since we're here in the Dalles, these are the pages I pasted together to get from the Dalles, and this map here is starting at Biggs, and to get to the Umatilla at modern-day Pendleton. So each one of these is about 7 miles, and I invite all of you to come up and take a look at these because they give an idea of how careful this topographer was collecting. Now, the entire Wright campaign was 760 miles round trip, and so we're doing about 40 or 50 miles. How far is it from here to Pendleton?
120.
Okay, so this is 120 miles, about 1/7 of his entire campaign, as it were. Thanks, Lauren. Just gather this up. The original copies I made were with an overhead Xerox, which was not very good, but I was very excited about it because it indeed changes how we view particularly the Steptoe campaign. Last summer, Mommy and I went back to Washington, D.C. with a digital camera. These are digital records, and the ones I show you are from digital images. And the reason they all appear clear is that I went through several programs that the camera came with, and the pages are very brown today, and Kriegel wrote so small that you couldn't read, or I couldn't read, the original documents. But by getting rid of the brown background, blowing up the images, and doing several color corrections, which I don't know what they did, but they made a better image, I was able to read them. Finally, it's quite a tribute to this guy, Kriegel. He wrote so clearly. He used a very sharp pencil, put a lot of information on each page. And with a magnifying glass, you can make out what he had to say. The problem I had is that he was German, and he mixed German Frachter with English printing. And so I had to learn his alphabet, and I'm still in the process of doing it. Okay, so we're going to do 2 battles and look at the campaign routes of both battles. Oh, I'm going to have to learn how to point this. Now I've reproduced this map over here of Washington, Idaho, and Oregon. And the Steptoe battle starts at Walla Walla, or campaign starts at Walla Walla, goes over to modern-day Moscow, up to the little village of Farmington, over to Rosalia, and back. So the red is indicated here is the Steptoe campaign, and on a regular road map, this is the Steptoe campaign route, up to Rosalia and back. In comparison, the Wright campaign starts at the Dalles, or one could say really Fort Vancouver, which is a little further down. But the actual place of assembling the troops was here at Fort Dalles, and then they marched to Pendleton, and then north towards Spokane, finally to Coeur d'Alene, or to Cataldo where the treaty was signed, and then back. Now I've done most of the route from north of the Snake, which is about here, to Cataldo and back. And I'm working on this part in this section in here. And I know very little of the route around the Dalles. It's incredibly confusing for me because it's 10 mile, 8 mile, 5 mile. I have the collecting maps, and they're clear when I'm an armchair topographer. But when I try to take the collecting maps and put them on a modern map, I'm at a loss, so I'm going to need some help. And so I'm not going to be talking much about the route from the first 15 or 20 miles of the Wright campaign route. So we'll start off then with our Steptoe campaign that started at Fort Walla Walla. I put new batteries in. Now our main actors for the, am I including you? The main actors are, of course, Colonel Steptoe and Governor Stevens, who was 2 years behind Steptoe at West Point. Steptoe graduated about in the middle of his class. Stevens graduated number 1 in his class. And not only number 1, he was number 1 in every course he took. And in the Steptoe campaign, the 2 officers that were killed in it were Gaston, who was suffering from throat cancer, and he hoped to die in battle, and he got his wish. The other was Captain Taylor. He, of course, didn't want to die in battle. His wife had just joined him at Fort Walla Walla, a squad of tragedy, for his 2 little daughters when we marched with Steptoe. Now, to set the... I didn't push anything. Now, since the stories that I'm talking to you about are really based on appreciation of the collecting field note maps and the collecting field notes on the bearings and the location sites, I thought it important to show you the beauty of his maps straight away. And to do that, I picked the junction of the Walla Walla River, it was right here, with the Columbia, at the great bend of the Columbia River. And you can look at, just get an idea of the enormous detail that he showed. And he was always concerned about paper, so he put as much on one page as possible. This part of the map right here, this lower part below the dotted line, you have to put the Walla Walla River from here up to there to hook it together. But the amount of detail is incredibly surprising, Here's a little sketch he made of Chimney Rock. It's right here. This is a sketch of Ross Point and Mackenzie Point. And here's Ross Point and Mackenzie Point here. This is what it would look like. So collecting not only just drew these beautiful maps, as you can see here, great detail. And he must have been on horseback most of the time. But he drew these little sketches of important topographical features that he saw in the countryside. And looking at the arrow, I'll get fairly close. Here we go. It's the old Fort Walla Walla, and here's the two chimney peaks, and he showed this little V between Ross Point, and one of these must be Mackenzie, I don't know which. But anyway, this was done, this is a Stanley Dale, and a lot of you are aware, I'm sure, of the radio reports, looking south past the old Fort Walla Walla. And I found these very interesting, these old lithographs are very interesting to kind of figure out what the countryside looked like in a lot of the forts. Now, to put the campaign that took place here in Oregon Territory in perspective of the United States today, we have St. Louis here, so everything, the topography and the map, the land was all well understood in this part of the United States, and also around Puget Sound, up the Columbia River to Fort Walla Walla. And everybody knew about Fort Benton. That's as far up as Missouri River you could go. But to get from Fort Benton to Walla Walla was difficult. You had to cross both the Bitterroot Range and the Rocky Mountains. And so Congress instructed the Army to put in a wagon road between these two forts, Walla Walla on the Columbia and Fort Benton on the Missouri. And that task was assigned to Lieutenant Mullen. And this shows, this is a Sohn lithograph of Fort Benton, Fort Benton, which is right here. They reconstructed that. And the reason we had Fort Benton, that's as far up the Missouri River as you could go. The other thing to consider in the 1880s is what was white and what belonged to the Indian. And you see in the early 1850s, half of what we now have as modern United States was Native American. But it changed very quickly in 15 years to this distribution of Indian-owned land, the sovereign land, and that land belonging to the United States. This range is limited. Okay. Now, it wasn't just so simple to put a wagon road in because people were already living here. There were a lot of Indians in the area between Fort Benton and Fort Walla Walla. There were the Ponderays, the Coeur d'Alenes, Luces, Nez Perce, who had a huge area in here, the Flatheads around Fort Benton, Walla Wallas, and there were plenty of roads from here to there. You could go anywhere you wanted in the Northwest on an Indian road. In fact, Mullen many times referred to the Indian trails as actual roads. They have been used for so many years that the trails have been turned into roads. And that's why it was so easy for the early pioneers to adapt the Indian roads to wagon roads. Anyway, there were a number of possible routes to get from Walla Walla to Fort Benton. One was this green one here, which is the Lolo Trail, used by Lewis and Clark, and that's a hellaciously difficult trail. And Governor Stevens knew right away that trail would be out. And he was well aware, in '53, he knew that the best way to get from Walla Walla to Benton would be to use the Coeur d'Alene Trail as indicated here, from Fort Walla Walla region up to the region around Spokane, and then you come across Panhandle, Idaho, and finally come to Fort Benning. And so this route was the put in the wagon route was given to Mullen, and he was assembling a road crew at the time that Steptoe was building the last Fort Walla Walla in the area that became Walla Walla. And of course, there wasn't a lot of regard to the fact that there were already Indians in the area. And the most important Indians to confront this road building scheme was the Coeur d'Alenes. And the Coeur d'Alenes had already, for the most part, 3/4 had already been converted to Catholicism. And I show Louise Soubry because she was the aunt of Chief Vincent, who was one of the major players in the Steptoe battle. So this is the Fort Walla Walla of 1858 that Steptoe had constructed. And Steptoe was certainly a very competent officer, and I'll come back to that. So he had the ability to build structures, build buildings that you need for a fort, and to put the fort in the proper location. We have what's called Steptoe Butte in the middle of the Palouse. I don't know how many of you folks have been up to the Palouse, but right smack dab in the middle is a peak that protrudes above the fields of lava, or the rolling Palouse Hills. And you can see this peak from any high peak from 40 miles around. It's like a lighthouse, a beacon that you can navigate through the Palouse. And we'll come back to that. It was played prominent during the Wright campaign. Whenever they were on the top of a large hill, they knew where they were. So we're talking about the Steptoe campaign. Steptoe encountered absolutely no problems from Fort Walla Walla to Moscow, Idaho. Then he crossed the Palouse River, about where the city of Palouse is, went on up along the Washington-Idaho border to Farmington, then crossed over to Rosalia. That was called at the time Ingossaman Creek, or Toholanuni by the Nez Perce. Now this map is a Kalecki map made 4 months after the Steptoe campaign. And why I show it is that it completely changes how we envision what had happened during the Steptoe campaign. Steptoe, with his 156 dragoons, had marched with no trouble from Walla Walla, so up, here's Walla Walla, along the Idaho border, over here to modern-day Rosalia, with no encounters with Indians. On the day of 16 May, he was stopped dead in his tracks about here. Now this map was made by Kalecki 4 months later, and he made it during the march back from Coeur d'Alene Lake to the Snake River. And this one little map right here shows the trail that Wright was on. And this little patch of water, it was dry at the time, it's now Stubblefield Lake, was indicated on the Kalecki map. And Mullen stated that they marched by the remnants of the Indian lodges who were involved in the Steptoe campaign. They were right here at Stubblefield. And Kalecki shows a group of teepees right here. And this is the village of Selah. And Steptoe was stopped right about here on a trail leading north by Chief Vincent and a few other chiefs. And Steptoe was surprised he was stopped because he had done nothing to provoke the Indians. On the other hand, the Indians felt they were being provoked because Steptoe kept changing trails. He'd been on a couple major trails heading north. Finally, he was on a really tiny little trail going northwest from Roselia, and it says trail to Colonel Steptoe, to Colonel Steptoe's battleground. Steptoe was on this little trail that dead-ended in the encampment of Sela here. Didn't go through it, dead-ended there. Well, of course the Indians thought they were under attack. Also, Steptoe had 2 mountain howitzers. And where they stopped Steptoe, the Indians right here, and there were about 1,000 Indians, and Steptoe said, well, where did all these Indians come from? That's kind of a quote. Well, they didn't have far to come. There were 34 lodges right here. And the Indians had been tracking him all the way from the Snake River. Well, Steptoe never made any mention that he was close to this village of Sela. He never saw it. I've been on this trail, and when you're a half a mile away from the village, you don't see a thing. You're still in the Blues Hills. And the village itself was the spring camas grounds where the Indians were digging camas. And that's why they were there. They'd been there for about a week. The camas fields around the historically important camas grounds, you have the Coeur d'Alenes, near their village, Coeur d'Alene, were still under snow at that time. And so every spring they would leave early, take the 60-mile trek to the west to dig early camas here. Steptoe didn't know it, he would stop here. That was the first part of it. And this is a picture of the area where the Indians, the blue haze is that of Camas. Here's some closer up here. And just to show you what Camas looked like, blue flower, kind of an onion about an inch across. And I dug this square foot of turf near our farm just to show the density. And there's about a dozen bulbs per square foot, and if you convert that to acre, it's quite a large number. And if you convert that to pounds, there's a lot of camas per acre, and that's why the Indians were very zealous of their camas grounds. This provided the starch that they needed. Okay. Now, 4 months later, Klecki visited the Steptoe battleground. So this is not made during the Steptoe campaign. This figure is the one that's published, actually, in the 35th Congressional Records. Rests on 2 maps made by Klecki when he was sent with Mullen and a few other troops to pick up the remains of the fallen soldiers and the 2 cannons at the Steptoe battleground. And so I'll show these in just a minute. But the right half of the map will exactly correspond to the original field notes. And there's nothing that corresponds to the left hand of the map, which is interesting. This part of the map, this quadrant, is incorrect completely. And I found a few errors in collecting maps. But this, he's got Pine Creek in the wrong place. It should be down here. He's got it coming up here. Here's Sela up here, the Indian encampment. And Roselia's here. The Steptoe would come on this trail, and he was stopped right about here. This part of the map is accurate. I guess that Dr. Randolph told Klecki about this little rock cliff right here and explained that there was a sheet of water here that the troops had splashed across. They were stopped here. The chief told him to go back. They argued a bit, but not long, because they were soon surrounded by 1,000 Indians. So that they thought they'd better retreat. So they retreated 2 miles and came to this little cliff. Steptoe had agreed to retreat. Vincent thought, okay, he's going to go back to Moscow or Farmington. But he didn't. He only went back 1.5 miles. camped here, and there's only 3 miles to Selah. Well, that didn't make the chief very comfortable, of course. And he picked an area that's quite defensible. And I'll show why. If you blow up this area right here, okay, here's the campground from the night of May 16th. And this is the camp right here. He was stopped here by the Indians on this trail, which dead-ended up at Selah here. They didn't go all the way back down here to Farmington. They went 1.5 miles or 2 miles along this cliff. So they had a defensible cliff to their rear, to the west, and there was a sheet of water in front of them. And I'll show another map of that. Here we go. Okay, so this is even a higher gain, and now you can see the clear contour lines of this cliff. And Colecki noted on this map that the contour lines are 50 feet intervals in elevation. The sheet of water that Greg talked about would have been here, that the troops splashed across to get to this redoubt, where they stayed for 3 hours mounted on a little loose hill while Steptoe talked with the chief. And nobody knows what he had to say. I asked my Indian friends, what do you think he said? And they said, we don't know for 3 hours. How many ways can we tell you, go back? So here's the cliff, and it's the only cliff within a radius of about 4 or 5 miles. And this is a little loose hill that Steptoe had escaped back to, and the troops remained mounted on this hill for 3 hours. Now, the next view is from the other side. And here I have a mask of Father Conley, so I have a priest, I have a historian, I have 2 Indians. The sheet of water was about here. The troops had remained on this little hill for the 3 hours while these men talked. That's Steptoe and Vincent talked for 3 hours, and we're not sure what was said. And my 2 Indian friends kept saying, I don't know how many times we can tell you, go home. So we had a lot of fun discussing what was said for 3 hours, standing at this site of the second parley. What I think happened was, well, at this time, Steptoe and Chief Vincent were parlaying together. Now, during the first parley, Steptoe used his Nez Perce guides, his interpreters, and he realized right away, I can't trust these Nez Perce guides because they led me into a trap. The Coeur d'Alenes did not like the Nez Perce Indians. They'd been at war for several hundred years, and they still don't like it for that matter. That's why they have a much better casino. And they love telling people that too. Now, for this second parlay, Steptoe and Chief Vincent were there for 3 hours. Now, Steptoe knew Parisian French from high school. And I think probably Vincent, I'm not sure. Now, this is conjecture, but it's as an amateur, I'm allowed to do this, right? This is the fun part. I think Vincent knew Voyageurs French because the Coeur d'Alenes traded a lot at Fort Colville. And the Hudson's Bay Company used Iroquois Indians for most of their forts and most of the trade with Indians. And I know that lots of Coeur d'Alene Indians indeed knew Voyageurs French. So the two may have tried to converse in French, and it would have been difficult, and it would have taken a long time. Now we're going to go back. These are the original. These are the original. One of the original field notes made by Colecki in that little book, the field note maps. And they were camped on the return route after Wright had already put the Indians, came down this little trail towards Rosalia. And he made a little figure here of a basalt mesa, a little knob. And that knob you can still see from Highway 195. It's a wonderful basalt knob, and it allows me to identify this hill here, this canyon, and the trail that went up to Sealand, right up here. I have sketched this in. This part was drawn by Pilecki, but I don't think he went up there. And this is where the second parlay took place. The morning of the 17th, Steptoe was up early. They were gone by 3 or 4 in the morning, marching back towards, marching south. Indeed, on the return route towards the Snake River. In the meantime, that night, Father Josette had ridden 60 miles from Mission on Coeur d'Alene River, we now call it Catawba, all the way to Sealand, to argue with Chief Vincent that, well, why don't we ride down and parlay again? But when they got to the camp, Steptoe was gone. They rode very hard, and they caught up to him about in here. And Steptoe wouldn't stop to parlay. Of course he wouldn't stop because he thought he would be subjecting his troops to an ambush. So he agreed to a marching parlay, and they agreed not to fight. You got to remember, most of the Coeur d'Alenes, of which Vincent was one, were Catholic, and they were zealous about being Catholic. That's why they really didn't want to fight. And Father Josette actually brokered this agreement. Let's don't fight until about here, and then they shook hands. However, after the Coeur d'Alenes agreed not to fight, they rode up onto this hill to watch the troops' progress as they turned into this canyon. This is the North Fork of Pine Creek. The Palouse Indians rode over to this bluff right here and opened up fire. So the battle started here, not because of the Coeur d'Alenes, but because of the Palouse Indians. And this is a painting by Norma Hennon. She's got this exactly in the right spot. She went there and looked. She didn't know it at the time. She just thought that would be a nice spot to make this handshake. And she, by chance, happened to get it exactly right. There's a little bluff here. They're in one of the little valleys running into North Pine Creek. This is Father Josette. This is a Nez Perce guide. Right after they shook hands, the Nez Perce guide whacked Vincent with his riding crop and called him a coward. I don't know what Steptoe did, but he acted immediately and refused the situation. And Victor, a sub-chief, said, well, let's each go home. It's all taken care of now. We can return back. So the quick thinking Steptoe averted a battle, the beginning of the battle right there in Coeur d'Alenes. Now this is the other half of the next section of map sketched by Pilecki of the battlefield. And here's this little basalt mesa again right here, which allows one to stitch the two maps together. And this is the course of Pine Creek. Hasn't changed a bit. Rosalia is sitting right in here. And if you go to Rosalia, there's a monument where Steptoe had his redoubt of the 17th of May. And that's exactly in the right spot where the monument is. So what had happened, Steptoe was marching back along about to here. And when he got pretty close to this mesa right here, the Palouse Indians started firing on them. And the cavalry held fire for quite a while. But then they decided about in here, they had better take this high ground. So they took this first hill right here, this collected sketch. And the Palouse Indians continued a very rapid fire on the soldiers. And the soldiers only had musketoons. They also had horse pistols. The musketoons were not good at long range. The Indians actually had a better rifle. The Hudson's Bay rifle had more range than the musketoon. they reached this, there's an airstrip now right here. They reached this first hill, and Lieutenant Gregg took the second hill. And when Lieutenant Gregg was on the second hill, the Coeur d'Alene's were watching what was going on. And Malcapsy, who was a hothead, said to his friends, now's the time to cut the head of the snake off. Let's charge down this ravine and get the next company breaking over the hill right here. Well, his friend says, we don't want to do that. Well, Vincent said, I just shook hands. We can't do this. So Malcapsy whacked his friends with a whip. This must be the way they got each other's attention, and called them cowards. And he said, well, you stay here. I go down and fight. So Malcapsy rode down into this canyon, started alone, and of course all his buddies said, well, you can't go alone, we'll join him. So Victor, Jean-Pierre, and Zachary, and 12 other Coeur d'Alene Indians joined Malcapsy, and they got right down here in this little ravine. Gregg saw what was going on. He bugled back to the main company, asking for a right angle scissor movement, and we'll catch the Indians in this ravine in a right angle charge. So Gaston charged down the hill. Gregg rode hard up the canyon and then charged at a right angle down the canyon. And they caught the Indian ponies in a right angle scissor movement. And they killed 12, just like that. I always wondered, how in the world is a cavalry going to catch the Indian pony? Never made any sense. But when you go there, you see what? The Indians were in this tight little ravine. They were pushed against the basalt wall, and at very close, pinpoint range, the musketoons were very, very effective. And that's why they were able to kill 12. The Indians had panicked, fired too soon, and there were no, at that point, there were no army fatalities. Well, anyways, it turns out Victor, who wanted peace, was killed. Jean-Pierre, who wanted peace, was killed. And Zachary was killed. And Malcapsy got back. And he crops up again during the Wright and come back to him. Anyway, the cavalry continued their retreat, and Taylor was shot from the source right about here along the Pine Creek. Then Lieutenant Gaston was shot from his horse. His company panicked and left him to die on the field. They continued their retreat to the modern day area right here. And this is a, can you see this all right? Can we turn out these lights? Maybe it would help you. Does that help at all?
Yes.
This is fairly faint, but I did take it from the original in the Library of Congress. And you can see the Palouse Indians sketched here in the forefront. There's a little hill right here. This is the redoubt that Steptoe was occupying. And this is Pine Creek coming like this. The Spokane Indians are here. And on the original, you can see in the distance on the horizon the Coeur d'Alene Indians. On May 15th, Steptoe had camped here on his way up the ceiling to the Indian village, so he knew where he was here. And there were really very few casualties inflicted during this redoubt period here. They were surrounded, they were down to very little ammunition, but Indians didn't know that. That night, they decided to retreat because the next day, surely they would be defeated and they would all be slaughtered. And so Steptoe and his men decided to retreat back. The Army account, well, secondary, tertiary accounts say they retreated under darkness. So I went back and I got the records, naval records of where the moon was at that day, that fateful day, and it was still almost a half moon. So it wasn't dark by any stretch of the imagination. And there's no indication that there was cloud cover. In fact, the whole Steptoe and his men a number of times on the march up had reported or written that the weather was extremely nice. So anyway, around 9 o'clock they decided to retreat. Now, the Army version not Stepwell's version, but our Stepwell just said they simply retreated. Secondary accounts said they snuck out under darkness. The Coeur d'Alene version is that we parted our lines and let them go. And that's probably more likely what did happen. The Palouse Indians were occupying along here. Maybe they all retreated back to this area to the east. In any event, Stepwell was able to escape and right back to that is about as spooky and electronic glitch as I have seen. Where we're just moving this through air causes that thing to change. I don't get that. But anyway, that's the Stepwell campaign. There were seven killed, and the outcome was horrendous because this was a major defeat. And this made big news back with Congress. And they directed the Army to immediately mount a large force and retaliate and teach the Indians a lesson. It was a punitive expedition, as it were, that Colonel George Wright was asked to head up. I think I heard a question.
Now, how many troops did Stepwell have with him?
158.
And he left the howitzers when he broke and ran.
Pardon me?
And he left his howitzers,
Yeah.
his cannon when he
Yeah,
when he
and all of his supplies too. I went over that a little quickly.
Okay.
And he left his supplies, and the Coeur d'Alene Indians got everything, and they didn't share with the other Indians. But they were happy to get the booty. And I think that probably says something what may have happened on the second and third parleys. That Vincent may have said, if you leave your stuff, we let you go home. And so when they left their stuff, the Coeur d'Alene Indians were happy enough. They had the booty, the warriors were pleased. They took the mules and the harnesses up to Fort Colville and sold everything to the Hudson's Bay Company. That did not set right, of course, with the U.S. Army. That's another story.
What were the numbers of both the Palouse and the Coeur d'Alene?
All total, maybe about 1,000 Indians. But the main Indians that were doing most of the fighting were the Palouse. The Coeur d'Alenes did have the one charge that I talked about. But probably casualties were about the same on both sides. Yes?
Where did you get the Coeur d'Alene version?
Pardon me?
Where did you get the Coeur d'Alene version of the story?
From the Cy Johns. Cliff Cy John was an elder at one time, and his brothers, Merle and Frankie, are descendants of Victor. And getting off this is kind of a neat story now that you ask. That's the trouble. We're doing two campaigns, and each one would be a lecture. But this is a good question for me to follow up on. We took Frankie and Merle on an excursion that we put. This is the Whitman County Historical Society, and I think it was a whole busload of folks that went on it, and these two Indians. And we took them right to where their great-great-great-grandfather had fallen during the Stepwell War. And it was quite an emotional outing because of that. They gave a couple prayers for the fallen Indian warrior, because that's important to do, even if it's 150 years late. And so they were very happy to have been on that actual site. And again, the actual spot was identified from that Plucky map. You know exactly within 50 feet where it happened. So, any other questions on? Yeah.
I admired one of your earlier maps showed all these contours. That particular one, unless they're up on a high ridge, did you compare those contours to an actual contour?
They are perfect. And I hope you come up and look at some of his original maps. The question had to do with the contour maps and collecting. They are incredibly accurate
I mean, compared to an actual contour map?
Compared to a modern topographical map, I cannot imagine how he did it. Many times they did 20 miles of march a day. That would be 3 of these maps, and they would be, for the most part, on. Except there was part of the battlefield map of Steptoe, that left-hand part, he wasn't there. I'm sure of that. But apparently, the Surgeon Randolph and a couple other officers told him about this cliff that Steptoe had managed to get his troops back onto after that first parliament for a protective.
I think the photogrammetry, what we use to do that, I think that, how they,
I don't know. I hope we can talk more about that if you know about it. Because it boggles my mind. Okay, so here we are. Any other questions about Steptoe? By the way, we can go back to questions afterwards. I have all afternoon free. So here's the Dows in 58, and I don't know who did this. This should be familiar to somebody. And anyway, if any of you have a question of one of these images or would like to have it, just leave me your email and I can email it to you. It's all digitized. It's one neat thing about it. Anyway, here's the Dalles. In 58, this would be the world of Wright. Now, these are the camps that he had to get from the Dalles. He didn't camp at Biggs, but he went through Biggs. Then he camped at Muddy Springs, and Moni and I just found that yesterday. And that was really exciting to find Muddy Springs. We were looking for it I wasn't, last summer and couldn't find it. And then he camped at John Days River, Rock Creek, Willow Creek, Butternut Creek. This was a long trip from Willow Creek to Butter Creek. It's 30 miles through desert. And I don't know how good the water was at Well Springs, but it was probably mainly alkaline because the whole flat's alkaline. And once they made it to Butter Creek, then they hit the Umatilla River, marched up the Umatilla to the second Umatilla campsite, which is right in Pendleton today, and then went north to Walla Walla. And while the troops were both at the Dalles, and actually started back in Fort Vancouver, they were practicing maneuvers and doing a lot of target practice. They had new rifles, and they continued that at Fort Walla Walla, right here. So we have to now put Wright in the proper perspective. Wright had been through the Mexican War. He knew what that was. In the American-Mexican War, he was decorated, and he was in a couple battles against 14,000 Mexicans. And during those battles, the U.S. suffered 1,500 casualties. So he knew what war was. And the Mexicans were no pushover. The Mexicans were extremely well trained in European tradition during the American-Mexican War. It was not the Mexican troops that were at fault, it was their officers weren't particularly good. And Santana was not good at all. So anyway, that's another story. We have to push on. Because again, as I said earlier, Wright did 760 miles round trip. And what was that distance again from the Dalles to so it's 120 here and another 40. It's about 160 up here to Fort Walla Walla. So there's a lot of space to cover. He's at Fort Walla Walla. He's got to get clear up here to the mission on the Coeur d'Alene River. Lake Coeur d'Alene's a pretty small dock right there. That's a lot of territory.
You show a St. Joe River, that's the Park Fork now?
No. The
That's
St. Joe River flows into what's now, the whole thing is called Lake Coeur d'Alene. We'll come back to that.
Okay.
at the time of the Wright
Excuse me, I'm
campaign.
on the wrong leg. I'm on the
Well,
wrong leg.
that's okay.
Okay, excuse me.
I'm just as confused here. Now, I put this in just to show, this is one of his notes, a page from the note, to give an idea of this beautiful script. And this is, what's that? This is on June 5th from camp to Deschutes. And the reason he crossed it out, that formerly the Army wanted the routes to be noted from Biggs, essentially, on. And so his first, and I have those, it's lucky I took them because he crossed them out. I didn't realize how important they were. So I have those images too. But it just shows how beautifully he wrote. And on each map, you have a location. These are the locations on a given map to go with this page. This is the odometer reading. This is the arrival time, departure time, and this is the grade that they marched up. And these are notes about the either the reading to the south or the north or the bearing. Now this is his sketch of the chutes, and yesterday I crawled up to about here on some private property and got a picture of this island with, I don't know if I'm going to be able to identify these, but I'll try to do that when I get back. This is the Columbia River, and when you read it in the back, this is a view, a sketch of the mouth of the Deschutes River right here. Now, this is the first, it's not the first map. These maps are so fuzzy and the light's so bad at the National Archives, I could never tell if I was in focus or not. So lo and behold, the map in front of this one, the most important one of the series, was fuzzy. So I got to go back and get that. So the trail is coming along the Columbia River. You get up to modern day Biggs, right here. It essentially followed, I guess that's Highway 30 today. And then it came up on, I think this is the Oregon Trail coming along on the ridge. And then this is, which highway here? Muddy Hollow Road is somewhere in here. And anyway, we found Muddy Springs that the Wright campaign camped on yesterday. It's right on this map right here. I can show you on a modern map. The Wright campaign okay, I forgot to put this in. This gives us, this is the same view of the Columbia River. Here's the island. And this is a trail that Wright was on. I think that's the Oregon Trail. This is Highway 97, and Mud Hollow Road comes off of it, and Muddy Springs Camp is right there. And we looked all along here from this road, and the only water we found was right in here. It's a sizable spring, and it is muddy. So that must be the right one. On the way to John Day's River, this is what we saw today. Well, last summer. I mean, it's changed a lot since Wright was there. And this just again shows the beautiful contours that you were talking about. And this is the dividing ridge coming down into the John Day's River. And here's the camp right here. And this canyon is just exactly like that. And this dividing ridge is where our cars parked right here. So they marched, I don't know which side they marched down on, but anyway, this is part of the trail that I just showed you on the collecting. It's amazing. Of course, my wife doesn't think it's so amazing because she doesn't quite have the passion I have. Some fellows there. And this is the mouth of John Day's River. I put an apostrophe in there. I think that's a mistake today, right? But I'm trying to use the spelling that Blackie used. So, I'm moving too fast. All right, look at this beautiful map here. Here is the camp on John Day's River, right here. They crossed the river right there, marched in the valley to about here, and then followed the mouth of Rock Creek up to where Rock Creek Canyon splits. And this is Cedar Grove or Cedar Spring camp on the Oregon Trails up in here. They camped down here, and I able to identify all those little curves and where he crossed over. It's unbelievably accurate. I don't know how he did it. This is about 10 miles across here. Anyway, he did. I don't know if he got off his horse to do this or he could do it while he was on the horse.
You know, I was just thinking about, they were moving 10 miles a day if you had your 160 miles right to 10. So if you ride 10 miles a day, how do you have time to put in those incredible contours?
I don't know.
It's just amazing.
I think this might be one of the most spectacular field notes. Well, I'm an amateur at it, but I've looked at maybe 30 or 40 field notes at the National Archives, and I've got images of a lot of them, and nothing matches these. So here we are. This is at the intersection where they were camped. And you can go right to that spot. Now, Wright had 700 men, 760 men, and 200 packers, 400 mules. I don't know why he needed 200 packers or mule skinners for 400 mules, but he did. 800 horses. So it was a huge complement of men and horses. They needed about 40 acres of grassland for that number of mules and horses. So they were spread out over a pretty good site. And maybe that's why they didn't always follow the Oregon Trail, because they needed good pasture on the way to the Umatilla. Now this is the route. Again, it's just a beautiful little sketch of the contours coming into Willow Creek. And the road comes right along there today. And they camped right about here on Willow Creek.
Well, that Shuttler Flat, should they come up with that rock creek? Is that the same as Shuttler Flat?
On that earlier slide, I don't know.
No, Shuttler Flat is east about 6 or 8 miles from
Rock Creek?
that building there and all those signs.
I don't know the
Shuttler,
local.
yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to answer that.
Is Old Lakes on Rock Creek?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I understand now.
We can always go back to one of those if you want from the originals. I'll be happy to show you those. So here is the Willow Creek campsite. It would have been right along this alfalfa field today. Oh, that's wrong. That's also Willow Creek. And I just made a mistake. Tony and I visited Butter Creek, and it's dry as a bone, and just, I don't know what the early immigrants did for water, but we didn't find any. And this is a mistake. That's just another shot of the wall. Now I show this one. This is, again, a beautiful map. Here's the Walla Walla River, and this is sketched in Pambrook. And I just met Pam Broom, this Pam Broom's great-great-grandson. And we found this spot of land a couple days ago, and he's standing there on his great-great-granddad's patch of land that the Wright campaign marched by 150 years ago. I mean, that's pretty spectacular. We know where we were because, again, this beautiful contour of this hill this shows the side view, and the skeleton is about 50 to 60 feet above the plains. And these are all nice house sites today. Good views off of it. But anyway, this is the way Wright marched up to get to Walla Walla. And this is the Whitman site right here. So they crossed the Walla Walla River right where Whitman had taken his mill race off from the Walla Walla. That's how precise those maps are. Now, they stayed at Fort Walla Walla for a few days, continued to train. He knew what he was doing. Wright certainly knew what he's doing to get prepared to the Indians. He had a lot of anxiety because, as you can see, he's here at Fort Walla Walla, and the Indians are somewhere up in this enormous area. And of course, if you're looking at a map back in Washington, you're looking at a map, and this enormous area is now the size of your fingernail. And of course, then the armchair army people had no appreciation for what Wright was getting into. And Wright had maps of this area. He knew how large it was, and how in the world was he to find the Indians. He did not really expect to. Yeah.
What was his mission then? Was his mission to find this road, or was his mission to find those Indians? And
Wright's mission was to punish the Indians involved in the Steptoe campaign and to clear the way for the road to Fort Benning. And he knew that the Coeur d'Alenes were the important Indians to be involved, because the Coeur d'Alenes were the gatekeepers of where we now find Highway 90. That's the way you get to Fort Benning, is on Highway 90. That's why Highway 90 is where it's at and not going on the Lowell Trail. Because it was a good trail from Spokane to Fort Benning. But Steptoe's purpose was simply to march through the land as a show of force. And that did not succeed. He was whipped. And he had the good sense to realize he was whipped and to get back. I mean, I think it was a heroic effort of his and a great decision to go back. He didn't want to. But anyway, that was the reason for the Wright campaign, was to punish the Indians involved in the Steptoe campaign, make sure that he could have a peace so that the road could go through. Otherwise, the road would not go through. And to cross the Snake River, when Steptoe did in May, was perilous. It's a raging current, even where Steptoe crossed at Red Wolf Crossing. Maybe that's why he went far to the east instead of crossing straight north of Fort Walla Walla like Wright did. Wright crossed a few miles up from the mouth of the Palouse. This is a Toucan here. He marched from Fort Walla Walla to the Toucan, down the Toucan, and then came across the Snake River here in boats for the troops, and the Indians swam horses across. He had 30 Nez Perce Indians who were guides, and there were no fatalities, no incident whatsoever in crossing this river. And as a kid, I swum the Palouse a few times. I mean the Palouse too, but I mean the Snake River above Lewiston. And it's an amazing current. I wouldn't do it today. But, so even though I'm trying to redo this, I'm not going to try to swim that. Well, it's all slack water anyway, probably. Anyway, he got the troops across, no problem. Before he did manage to get them all across, they had an enormous rainstorm, and they had to stay here on the other side of the Toucan for a couple of days and dry out, which was amazing because they were in a drought like the Northwest had never seen. It was the middle of a 10-year drought. The grass was tinder dry. The Indians knew that. The Indians were going to let them come into the Palouse and then set fires to them and hopefully get them trapped. So the Indians had a plan too. And of course the Indians were watching their progress every step of the way. He got across with no trouble. So here he is. He's right here ready to cross the Palouse River, right? The Snake River right here. A little bit to the east of the Palouse River. This is looking back. Here's looking up the Toucan, right across, right here, and you can see how accurate Monahangan's painting is. Wright camped right on this bench right about here, overlooking the Snake River. And here, oh darn. Here is another of these wonderful collecting maps, but he had a couple days to do this one. Here's the course of the Snake River, going here down, the mouth of the Palouse River. This is the Toucan River coming in to the Snake River, and the dotted line is his trail. And I have to admit, I didn't walk this. It's 1,800 feet from the Snake River up to the plateau. I used my four-wheeler. So I cheated a bit. The troops didn't get to cheat. The next campsite was 18 miles north at this point. You can see they made a jog right here coming up. They continued north. And I've identified every bit of this trail within 50 yards. And I'll show you these 2 points here in just a moment. Coming down this little ravine and going up the other side to get to the Palouse River at present-day Hooper. When they were up about halfway up the canyon, they could look over the canyon wall. Anyway, the troops that were on left flank could look over into the Palouse River Canyon, into this view. They did not march by Palouse Falls. They were in to the east, about 4 or 5 miles. But isn't that a spectacular canyon? We're just a couple miles upriver from the mouth of the Palouse River. And this is the trace. It's still there, coming down the one ravine that I talked about. It's kind of, there's a lot of ash in it and sand, and that's why it's easy to find. And this is going up the other side of the ravine, and you can see that, well, maybe I have too much imagination, but anyway, the ground has a different texture right where this red line is. And I believe that was the course to get up, and then they went around this hill. This is a modern Jeep road today, but this is the trace that Wright was on. Does it look, did I convince you? You don't have to be. So they went by, that was a pretty quick trip. They went by Palouse Falls. This one was by Gustav Sohn, who was a sketch artist, also a German. Was Wright ever what? He had not only Mullen, who was the official engineer, photographer on this campaign, wrote extensive notes, which you can hardly read, and I have all the originals. But he had the luck to have Sohn and collect. This was done earlier by Sohn. So they knew a lot of the topography in the area. Now the next campsite was Camp Aspen, and this is a little section of the camp. And here's Camp Aspen with the date, and here's a little lake right here, and he wrote lake in it. And on my original Xeroxes, I couldn't even read that. And that only comes clear when you do the manipulations of the original. You get rid of the brown background, the paper is turned brown, and to sharpen the pencil marks by a sharpening program that does that. But it just shows his beautiful printing. And by the way, he took bearings of the North Star regularly. Now, I haven't even learned to do that yet. That's another task I have to do. And this is a small lake. They call it Camp Aspen. And that's a small lake that's still there today. And here's some of the aspen growth. It's just amazing when you can go to that actual site and follow the route as he progressed north. So he's right about, here's the Snake River, here's Palouse. He marched north of Palouse, and he's in one of these camps about here at Camp Aspen. Still about 40 miles from Spokane. Now, this is another figure that I find just amazing. Can you see that in the back okay? It's amazing because here's a little columnar basalt sketch right here. And I'm just showing a few of these. Every map has every topographical feature that's important sketched on it. They call this the Giant's Causeway, and that sketch is put on. Now, a number of you will recognize this. This is the formal map. I invite you to come up and look at it later. This is the formal map made by Mullen that went to Congress. This is published in the 35th Congressional Record. This map has been made from these collecting maps that I have here. But how do I know that? Well, I know it because each map between the first bearing location and the last bearing location on every map, back in Washington, they drew a line and they used that overall bearing to construct that bearing off of the 150 individual field note bearings. And so this is a fairly accurate map, but it only gets you within 6 miles. So this is the only map I have at first, and I couldn't really find where Wright had been on most of these campsites. So this is amazing. Here's this columnar of basalt right here. This is called Crooked Knee Lake now, this little lake right here. And the trail marches through here. And my wife had the good nature to follow me on this trail. It's about 7 miles from here to here. And there's a lake covered with bulrushes right here. And I could never find that lake because it's not there anymore. Somebody drained it 100 years ago. And that was never indicated on the modern topography map. Now this is a blow-up of that middle part. You can see the basalt cliff of hexagonal columns. And this yellow line is the start of the mesa. It comes around like this. It's about 1.5 miles in diameter. And here's the other side of the mesa, of the second mesa. And the troops march between, through a little valley, between these two mesas. This is looking from the top of the eastern mesa, right here, that swings around. And here's the edge of it. This is the other mesa to the west. The troops march up this valley. And this is probably the mesa that Plecky sketched. And I used to like to say, well, you can't climb those. So I made the mistake of having my nephew come with me. And of course, there he is, showing the need to get up there. It caused a lot of anxiety. Which wasn't so bad, but the next thing, there's my granddaughter up there. And this gives an idea of the extent of just one of these walls. And on top of each one of these mesas are these hexagonal blocks. So you're walking on, there's a lot of dirt on it, but you're walking on top of these mesas that are surrounded, and Wright was marching between them. And of course, the Indians were certainly on top watching it too. And here's my wife Moni to show that she had good nature to go with me. This little pond right here was on the collecting map, exactly at that spot. On the collecting map, it's about a 32nd of an inch in diameter. So that shows how sharp this pencil was, because it wasn't just a dot, it was a circle. Now, the next spot to reach was Camp Pedregal. Here it is. And I think I'm going to skip some. Let's see. No, I didn't. And I show this because this is the first charge of the Indians. And this little ridge here I was able to identify. And can you see these red notations right here? You don't have to read them, just see that there's some red notations. Is that clear?
Yes.
Oh, okay, all right. This line, this location point is connected by this line to the first location point down here, and that bearing was used to construct that part of the map, of the formal map that Congress got. I didn't see any of that my first trip back to Washington, D.C. That only really became apparent when I did the color correction part on the computer program. I found that amazing. So, they broke camp at Camp Pedregal, and they called that Camp Pedregal because this part of the train must have reminded him of the Pedregal formations just outside of Mexico City. And to take Mexico City, but of course they already did, they took Mexico City. And so I think that's probably